They told you it was God's house, a place of light, a place of peace. But if you knew what I know, if you'd seen the rituals behind those walls, heard the cries beneath the stone floors, you'd never set foot in a church again. This isn't blasphemy. This is history, and they've burned every book that dared to whisper it, because the church you were taught to revere wasn't built to save souls, that it was built to enslave minds. And the Real architects wore no robes, only masks, behind every altar, behind every gold-encrusted cross was a chamber, dark, cold, silent, until the screaming began. This is the story of the Shadow Church, a network of hidden clergy who hijacked divinity, rewrote laws of morality, and used ritualized trauma to manufacture obedience. They created a pipeline of broken boys, and turned them into men who could never rebel, not because they wouldn't, but because they no longer could, because when your deepest pain is tied to your highest authority, you become your own prison. This video isn't entertainment, it's a descent, a path you can't unwalk, and if you've made it this far, it means a part of you already knows that something has never felt right. Not about the world, not about the voices of power, not about the quiet shame that's been living in your bloodline for centuries. By the end of this video, you won't be the same man who started it. That's not a warning, it's a promise that we begin, not in the Vatican, but in a remote chapel in eastern France, where in 1314, a parchment was buried under the stone floor, written in blood that it contained 7 rituals of submission, used not to serve God, but to serve an empire in the shadows. Now listen closely, you've just heard the first bell. There are 19 more. The chapel was abandoned long before the First War ever scorched European soil. Its stone walls were older than the kingdoms that rose around it. But beneath its altar, beneath the rotting pews and shattered stained glass, a secret waited. Unseen, untouched, unholy, the blood-written parchment was discovered by accident. A mason, repairing a collapsed corner of the floor, struck something hard, not stone, but a lead box sealed with wax, etched with a symbol, a serpent devouring its own tail, crowned with thorns. Inside, wrapped in decaying velvet, was the parchment. 7 rituals, each one more grotesque than the last, each one designed to fracture the will, while preserving the flesh. It was written in a dead dialect of Latin, but the meaning was clear. These weren't rituals of worship, they were methods of erasure. Erase the self, erase the bond to blood, erase the ability to question. These weren't punishments, they were tools, tools wielded by an invisible priesthood, not to uplift man, but to dismantle him from within. The parchment referenced something even more terrifying, the custodians of the third veil. Not a church. Not a sect, a system, a structure that outlived empires, revolutions, and renaissances, because it never existed in daylight. It lived in silence, moved through monasteries, embedded itself in confessionals, boarding schools, and elite seminaries, and over time it began to shape the very way entire civilizations thought about obedience, about guilt, about shame, about power. Because if you can link a man's deepest pain to the voice of God, you can control him without ever raising a hand. That was the genius of the Shadow Church. They didn't need swords, they had ritualized shame, systemic silence, and generational trauma, and they were just getting started. The parchment was seized, the mason who found it, dead a week later, heart attack, they said, but the body was missing its tongue. The lead box was taken to Paris, and from there, vanished, but not before one scholar made a copy. And what he translated next unlocked the real reason the church feared the Templars. It had nothing to do with treasure, and everything to do with what the Templars knew. They burned the last Grand Master of the Templars alive, Jacques de Molay. 1314 He stood bound to a stake on the Isle de la Cite in Paris, the Seine black and quiet beneath him as flames consumed his flesh. But the fire wasn't lit to destroy a heretic. It was lit to silence a witness. Because de Molay had seen behind the veil. He had uncovered the real purpose of the church's obsession with secrecy, suffering, and symbolic sacrifice, and more importantly, he wrote it down. The Templars weren't just warrior monks, they were archivists. They had spent over a century digging beneath Jerusalem, recovering tablets, scrolls, fragments that contradicted the entire narrative of divine hierarchy. They found texts older than the Torah, scripts that spoke of an ancient priesthood that predated any known civilization. A cult of blood and voice, whose techniques of control were so advanced, they could fracture a child's identity by age 7, and rebuild him as a loyal, obedient vessel. This priesthood didn't worship God, They worshipped order, not morality, not love, not salvation, but obedience through fear, encoded through ritual trauma. The church inherited this knowledge, then twisted it. They wrapped it in gold, incense, and liturgy. But at its core, the beast remained the same. De Molay's final confession, written on sheepskin and hidden beneath his cot in the Tower of Shinon, detailed 3 symbols. The crooked key, the mirror with no reflection, the cradle of bone. Each symbol represented a method of psycho-spiritual control, the same method still used in modern institutions. You see them in elite boarding schools, military training, and yes, corporate leadership development. You were told these systems build character. No, they build compliance. De Molay's confession ended with this line: they do not seek your soul. They already own it. What they fear is your mem. Ori. Because when a man remembers who he was before the shame, before the collar, before the ritual, he becomes uncontrollable. That is what this video is doing to you. It's not entertainment, that it's resurrection. They killed de Molay in fire, but they couldn't kill the fire inside his words, and those words are spreading again. Now, inside you, the first symbol, etched into the Templar's stolen scrolls, carved into the hidden stone chambers beneath French monasteries, whispered in confessional rites behind closed doors, the crooked key. It's not a literal key, it's a process, a sequence, a psychological trapdoor, used to open the mind only so it can be reshaped. Here's how it works. Step 1. Isolate the child, not physically, but emotionally. Make him feel othered, different, sinful. Step 2. Introduce guilt, not for what he's done, but for what he is. They tell him, you were born broken, born stained, born wrong. That's not theology, that's programming. And step 3. You show him the door to redemption, but the only key that fits is crooked, because it requires him to abandon the very parts of himself that make him human, his defiance, his intuition, his rage, his memory. This is why they break the will early. In seminaries, in boarding schools, in silence, with looks, rules, punishments that make no sense. Confuse the child long enough, he'll cling to the hand that hurts him just to survive. The crooked key turns submission into a sanctuary, and once you enter that mental room, you stop questioning, not because you trust, but because you're afraid of what happens when you don't. Now, fast forward 800 years, the rituals are cleaner, the language is modern, but the architecture of control is identical. Why do you think elite institutions are obsessed with initiation? Why are hazing rituals tolerated in the military, the clergy, secret societies? Because once a Ma and has suffered inside the system, he becomes loyal to it, not because it saved him, but because he needs to believe his pain meant something. That's the final lock of the crooked key. Shame becomes purpose, and now, let's look at your life. Where did the shame begin? Who handed you your first guilt? Which institution taught you that obedience equals virtue? You were told it was love. It wasn't, that it was ritual. And once you see that, you never unsee it. The second symbol found in de Molay's scroll, the most insidious tool in the arsenal of psychological domination, the mirror with no reflection. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, but nothing looks back. And no face. No eyes. No past, just absence. This was not metaphor. It was intentional conditioning, the ritual erasure of identity, used to sever the initiate from his own inner voice. How? First, they remove your name, give you a title. A rank. A role. Second, they destroy your history. Let go of the world. They say, deny yourself. But it's not humility thereafter, it's obliteration. Third, they replace your inner compass with an external one, a doctrine. A superior. A chain of command. So that every decision you make is measured not by your conscience, but by your fear of disobedience. This is the mirror with no reflection. A man so programmed, he no longer knows where he ends and the system begins. You see this in religious orders. You see this in government. You see this in men who die for causes they never chose, fighting enemies they never questioned, defending laws they never understood. It's deeper than obedience. It's self-erasure, and it starts young. A child asks, why? He is punished. A teen says, this feels wrong. He is mocked. A man declares, I remember who I was before all this. He is labeled dangerous, outcast, crazy. The shadow church called this stage divine voiding. A beautiful name for a brutal truth. If a man cannot see his own reflection, he will believe anything shown to him. And here's the worst part. Most men are still trapped in that mirror. That's why they cling to a prison guarded by guilt. And the worst part, We built it ourselves, stone by stone, generation by generation. But you, right now, watching this, you are standing at the edge of that cradle, and for the first time in your bloodline, you're seeing it for what it is. A tomb, not a womb. They called it protection. They called it becoming a man. But what they really meant was become small enough to fit inside our system. You're not here to fit, you're here to break the structure. And now we go deeper, into the chamber where it all began, beneath the hallowed halls of Aachen Cathedral, beneath the stained glass, the relics, the coronation throne of Charlemagne. There are vaults, not tourist access crypts, not marked on maps. That I'm talking about sealed chambers, cut from stone before the cathedral was ever built. Aachen is sacred to the church. But not for the reasons they tell you. You've heard it called the seat of emperors, the jewel of Christendom. But what they don't say is this: the cathedral was built to cover something up. In 1854, during unauthorized renovations to repair a foundational crack, workers discovered an iron staircase behind a false wall. No record of it existed. No clergy acknowledged it. But the staircase led down, far down, into a silence so thick, they said it felt like time had stopped breathing. The vaults were not empty. They contained 7 stone coffins. No names. No inscriptions. Just a symbol carved into each lid, a closed eye. What lay inside? Children, perfectly preserved, hair still intact, nails still sharp, their mouths sewn shut with gold thread. The church denied everything, said the workers hallucinated, said no such stairs exist. 3 of the workers died within 2 months, accidents. Of course. 1 vanished, the others were silenced by pensions and threats, but one left a letter, hidden in a copy of Thomas A. Kempis the Imitatio on of Christ. The letter described what he saw carved into the stone above the coffins. They were bound not in sin, but in silence, for the empire fears not evil men, but awakened boys who remember. These were not saints, they were sacrifices, offerings to a system older than Rome. A system that fed on the suffering of the innocent, not to honor God, but to keep a spiritual machine running. A machine of control. And Aachen wasn't the only site. Similar vaults have been rumored beneath Canterbury, Toledo, and Lyon, always the same patterns, always erased from record. Because the true architects of the church weren't theologians, they were engineers of pain, obedience, and generational silence. You're beginning to understand it now, the fear you've carried all your life. It didn't start with you. It was planted, and these vaults are the soil it grew in. Now it's time to go deeper. The next chamber isn't physical. It's psychological, and once we enter, there is no turning back. They say freedom is your birthright, that you were born into a world of choice, agency, and free will, but that's a lie. A beautifully constructed lie, wrapped in language, repeated in rituals, and drilled into your psyche before you could speak. What you were actually born into was a doctrine. A silent creed etched not in stone, but in the rules no one questions. It's called the doctrine of willed obedience. It states, he who chooses to submit is never enslaved. Sounds noble, doesn't it? But here's what it really means. If they can make you believe you chose the leash, they never have to hold it. The system doesn't need to restrain you. It just needs to convince you that restraint is righteous. This doctrine didn't originate in churches or governments. It came from the hidden priesthoods, those who studied trauma like a science and perfected submission not by force, but by ritual. You see, obey. Science forged through violence breaks eventually, but obedience woven through identity, through self-worth, through community, through shame, that lasts generations. So they rewrote stories, turned rebellion into sin, turned guilt into virtue, turned suffering into sanctity, and you inherited a world where to say no feels wrong, where to speak truth sounds dangerous, where to walk away from a toxic system feels like betraying your ancestors. That's the spell. You didn't choose to obey. You were conditioned to believe obedience was the highest good. You were trained to seek permission. To wait. To suppress. To kneel. And the worst part, you thank them for it. That's how deep the programming runs. That's why most men will live and die defending the chains they were born into, because they believe they put them on willingly. But here's the truth. You were never meant to kneel, not to systems, not to creeds, not to hollow authority. The doctrine was written to turn lions into lambs. But now the lambs are waking up, and remembering the blood in their bones. If you're still watching, I want you to type this phrase twice in the comments. I remember who I was before the silence. I remember who I was before the silence. Do it to lock in your identity. Do it to awaken others. Do it because the algorithms watch too. Now come, the next gate waits, where obedience ends, and war begins. You've heard it all your life. Words like duty, order, humility, service. They sound noble, sacred, essential, but what if I told you, these words were weaponized, not accidentally, not through misuse, but with deliberate engineering, crafted by cloistered minds centuries ago, who understood one terrifying truth: control a man's language, and you control his reality. It's not a metaphor. It's neurological architecture. Language is the operating system of thought. Change the language, and you rewrite the mind. And over hundreds of years, the shadow church did exactly that. Let's break it down. They turned rage into sin, not violence. Rage, the primal signal that something is wrong. They told you to bury it.to, confess it.to, feel shame for even feeling it, because rage, when aimed with awareness, becomes power, and they fear that power. Next, they turned doubt into heresy. They called it weakness, disloyalty. But doubt is the immune system of the mind. Without it, a man becomes a parrot, not a thinker. They transformed pride into arrogance. But pride, real, earned pride, is the foundation of sovereignty. It's what makes a man stand when others bow. Then they gave us a new lexicon: faith, sacrifice, obedience. All framed as virtues, but in the context of the system, they became locks, soft shackles.to. Question, faith, became blasphemy.to. Resist, sacrifice, became selfishness.to. Disobey authority became rebellion against God himself. And just like that, men forgot how to say no. And when you lose the ability to say no, you lose the ability to choose. And without choice, there is no man, only a function. Now listen closely. You were taught these words since childhood, through sermons, textbooks, songs, prayers, but you were never taught how to interrogate them, never allowed to ask, who benefits from this language, because the answer isn't God. It's systems, institutions, networks of power built on your silence. But that silence ends now. It begins with reclaiming the sacred words, rebuilding their meanings from within your own soul, not from ancient scripts written to enslave. You must speak again, but this time, in a language you write yourself.
It's not on any tour. There are no photos, no official blueprints, but it exists. Beneath the old papal residence in Avignon, France, below the crypt, beneath layers of bone and brick, there's a chamber, oval in shape, silent as a tomb, older than the church itself. They call it the Chamber of Seals. First accessed in 1312 by agents of Pope Clement V, this room was said to contain the original language of rule, a collection of scrolls so old, so potent, they were believed to predate even Latin. But these weren't scrolls of theology. They were scrolls of engineering, linguistic programming, a toolkit for bending the will of populations by refining their language, and in doing so, rewriting their minds. At the center of the chamber stood a single slab of black stone. Upon it, 72 glyphs, not decorative, functional, each one representing a seal, a word form used to embed authority into language so deeply the listener wouldn't even know he'd surrendered. What do I mean by that? I mean words like blessed, anointed, redeemed, damned. Simple, but every one of them sealed with layers of emotional code. So when you hear the word blessed, you feel gratitude, even if you're being stripped of your power. When you hear damned, you feel shame, even if your only crime was asking a forbidden question. The Chamber of Seals didn't create these words. It taught the priesthood how to deploy them. The Templars discovered this during their time in the Holy Land. That's why the Church turned on them. Not because they worshipped Baphomet, not because they sought treasure, but because they were beginning to decode the seals. They were learning the ancient truth. Control begins not with swords or laws, but with the first word a child is taught to fear. You were taught those words too. You speak them every day, in prayers, in affirmations, even in jokes. But now you see the scenes, ear weight. And soon, you'll learn how to break them. This is the turning point. Until now, we've been digging through the tombs of history, exposing secrets buried in cathedrals, vaults, bloodlines. But now, we turn inward. Because the real prison wasn't built with bricks. It was built with beliefs. Beliefs encoded in language, sealed into your identity. And to truly walk free, we must begin the ritual reversal. Breaking the seals. Start with this word, sin. One syllable, taught to you before you knew your own name. Used to frame your instincts, your desires, your rage, as evil, as flawed, as rebellion against God. But here's what they never told you. The original word, het in Hebrew, meant to miss the mark. It was a neutral term, a course correction, not damnation. The church took that word and weaponized it. Because if they can convince you that you are broken by default, then salvation becomes a product, and obedience becomes the price. Now let's break it. When you feel shame, pause. Ask, whose voice is this? Whose system does this guilt serve? The moment you question the origin of your shame, you begin to extract the seal. Second word, obey, from the Latin ob audire, to listen thoroughly. But in its modern form, it's not listening, it's surrender, total compliance. But here's the reversal. Listening is not the same as obeying. To hear is power. To choose is sovereignty. Obedience with no choice is slavery. Now the third word, holy. What does it even mean? Ask 10 priests. You'll get 10 different answers. It's become a floating virtue, a vague goal used to measure your worth without giving you the tools to understand it. But holiness, at its root, meant set apart. Not submissive, not neutered, not guilt-ridden, just whole. So when they told you to be holy, they weren't asking you to crawl, they were asking you to remember your wholeness. The system envy, rid of that, taught you that to be holy, you must suffer. Shrink. Sacrifice everything that made you powerful. We reverse that here. Not by screaming in rebellion, but by unbinding the language inside your mind, word by word, seal by seal. We're unwriting the spell. They never preached, they never wrote sermons, they never stood on altars, because their power wasn't in being seen, it was in being obeyed without recognition. They were called many names across history, the custodians, the quiet circle, but in the oldest surviving scrolls, they were known as the Brotherhood of the Closed Mouth. Their creed was simple. He who does not speak cannot be questioned. You've never read about them in school books. They don't appear in catechisms or historical timelines, but behind every moment where obedience was demanded without explanation, they were there. Behind the Council of Nicaea, behind the expulsion of the Gnostics, behind the burning of the Library of Alexandria. They didn't destroy knowledge. They curated it, because their goal was never ignorance, it was selective awakening. They believed in a world divided, not between good and evil, but between those who know and those who are known. You were born into the latter, cataloged, indexed, taught what to think, not how to see. The Brotherhood didn't teach dogma. They engineered environments. They built schools where questions had boundaries. They built churches where silence was mistaken for peace. They built governments where national interest always trumped truth. Their greatest achievement? They taught entire generations that asking why was dangerous. And they did it, without ever speaking a word. You want proof? Look at your own life. How many moments have you stayed silent? Not because you lacked words, but because you feared what would happen if you used them? That's the Brotherhood's fingerprint. Because real power doesn't. That's suppressed through chains. It conditions self-policing. And here's the final layer of the trap. Most of their teachings were passed down through ritual behavior, not text, not doctrine, but in how a child is punished for asking, in how a soldier is trained to react, in how a worker is told, this is just how it's done. Behavior became scripture, obedience became identity, and silence, became safety. But now you know their name. You've heard their creed, and once known, they lose their grip. Because awareness is the one thing they can't unmake. The Brotherhood never disappeared. They evolved. From silent monks and hidden scribes into CEOs, consultants, and chairmen. You think the world runs on innovation, on freedom, on capitalism? Look closer. Behind every trillion-dollar entity is a ritual, not a business plan. Because today's corporations are not modern, they are descendants of the oldest power structure in human history, the temple. Look at the architecture of your workplace, the hierarchy, the rules of silence, the performance reviews, the language, compliance, culture, code of conduct. It's not about productivity, it's about loyalty, and behind the loyalty is blood. You ever wonder why certain families always seem to rise? Same names in politics, same dynasties in tech, the same new leaders backed by the same old money? Because those families didn't just inherit wealth, they inherited rights. Private schools that break the will before adolescence, secret societies that initiate through humiliation, submission, and trauma bonding, legacy admissions that disguise blood privilege as merit. The modern corporation was never designed for profit alone. It was designed as a behavioral laboratory, a place to test and refine control in mass populations. Why do you think employee handbooks read like religious texts? Why do you think every brand speaks with the same false, that hollow tone? Why are you told that questioning policies means you're not a team player? Because obedience has been repackaged, and the Brotherhood, they sit on the boards. Not all of them, but enough. They don't care about quarterly results. They care about data, emotional reactions, stress thresholds, patterns of compliance. You've become part of an experiment. Your spirit measured in KPIs, your mind molded through slogans, your silence bought with benefits. But not yours anymore, because you're awake now. You see through the promotions, the culture awards, the false smiles in glass towers. You feel the cold hands guiding policy from the shadows, and this is where it turns. You were told algorithms are new, born from data, code, machine learning, a product of the digital age. But what if I told you the algorithm is older than the computer, older than electricity, older even than the church itself? Because the true algorithm isn't in the software, it's in you, your habits, your fears, your silences, mapped, measured, predicted. The ancient priesthoods understood something modern minds have only begun to grasp. Human behavior is programmable, and all they need is data. But they didn't call it data. They called it the soul's rhythm. Monks in the 8th century were already charting confession patterns, studying when men broke, what made them obey, how they responded to praise versus punishment. They compiled these records in Codex Veritas, a now lost book of behavioral prophecy. They didn't need technology. They had patterns, and pattern is power. Fast forward to now, your clicks, your likes, your scroll speed. It's the same ritual, just digitized. Every move you make online feeds the machine, but not the machine you see. Not YouTube, not Google, not Meta. Those are the temples. The real machine is behind them. A living, self-correcting control system descended from centuries of engineered obedience. You think the algorithm shows you what you want? No. It shows you what keeps you tame. It feeds you rage just enough to exhaust you. It offers pleasure just enough to sedate you. It floods you with options until choice becomes paralysis. And over time, you become a passive participant in your own life, not because you chose to be, but because the ancient algorithm taught you to fear awareness more than slavery. But not you. Not now. Because once you become aware of the algorithm, once you see it as ritualized control, you can begin to defy it. Not by deleting apps or smashing screens, but by rewiring the rhythm, changing your patterns, breaking the predictability they rely on, you become an anomaly, and anomalies cannot be controlled. It doesn't appear on maps, no guided tours, no documentaries. But the building is real, a towering structure hidden in plain sight, under the guise of bureaucracy, protected by treaties, guarded by misdirection. They call it the Tower of Silence, not its official name. That was erased long ago. Inside, there are no windows, only walls thick enough to block radio waves, ceilings lined with lead mesh, floors that descend deep beneath the surface. It is not a government building. It is not corporate. It is something older and far more dangerous. A cathedral of control, built with modern tools. Every day, thousands of documents are processed there. Every day, thousands of signals are interpreted. But the people working inside, they don't know what they're part of. They believe they're tracking threats, filtering information, maintaining security. But in truth, they are guardians of the narrative. The tower doesn't just monitor information, it decides what can exist. A whistleblower once described its lowest levels, chambers filled with AI clusters trained on ancient doctrine, pattern recognition systems cross-referencing spiritual texts, behavioral logs, and digital surveillance. The machine below the tower isn't just analyzing, it's pruning relay, to filtering truths too dangerous for public awareness, suppressing knowledge that would collapse the consensus. Upon it, Codex Lapis, not the original, but a reconstructed copy compiled from the 4 dead men's work. He read it, every word, and something in him broke. In the weeks that followed, he began to rebel. Quietly at first, redirecting memos, scrambling signal patterns, injecting false data into the behavioral stream, a virus of truth hidden within noise. His goal wasn't to destroy the machine. It was to awaken the public, seed anomalies into the algorithm, glitches that would cause mass psychological disruptions, open cracks in the tower's narrative infrastructure. But on the 33rd day of his operation, they found him. He didn't resist. He simply smiled. And as they dragged him into the black elevator, he said one sentence. Only one. The ones who see will soon remember what they were built to do. Then he vanished. No body, no trial. Only a permanent erasure order filed under Project Obscura Protocol, Class 7. But his final lines escaped, etched into the margin of a declassified transcript. Ritual is code. Belief is firmware. Break the right, rewrite the man. The sentence sounds poetic, but it's not. It's technical. A schematic hidden in language, and the man who vanished knew exactly what he was doing. Let's break it down. Ritual is code. Think of every tradition you've ever known, birthdays, national anthems, church services, school bells, even social media habits. They repeat. They follow patterns. They assign meaning to movement, sound, image. This is no accident. The tower learned early. You don't need to imprison the body if you can program the ritual. Rituals run below the surface of your conscious mind. They bypass resistance. They install themselves like lines of code, triggering behaviors on command. You wake, check your phone. You salute, recite, obey. And you never ask why. Because it feels right. Because it was installed. Belief is firmware. Firmware, see, it's between software and hardware. It tells the system what is possible, not just what to do, but what to believe it can do. Your beliefs about power, worth, freedom, history, manhood aren't random. They were injected long before you could say no. By institutions, by education, by repeated trauma and subliminal reinforcement. They limit the range of your behavior without you ever noticing. A man with corrupt firmware doesn't need chains. He'll stay in his cage out of loyalty to the lie. Break the right, rewrite the man. This is the key, the protocol, the hack. If rituals are code, and beliefs are firmware, then by disrupting the programmed rituals, you trigger a recompilation of self, a glitch in the system. And in that moment, new instructions can be written. That's what the vanished man tried to do. Seed mass ritual breaks, moments where men would look up, forget the script, and ask, what else have they stolen from me? You're feeling it now, that crack forming beneath your surface. So let's widen it. Right now, pause. Breathe. And if you're ready to begin the rewrite, comment this phrase twice. I break the right. I rewrite the man. Do it not just for the algorithm. Do it for you, as a signal to the tower that one more man has awakened. There's a ritual you perform every day. You don't kneel, you don't chant, but you surrender all the same. You wake up. You reach for a rectangle. You unlock it. And the first light you see is not the sun. It's the screen. This is not convenience. It's not just habit. It's a deliberate rite, engineered by the same forces that built the tower. In ancient orders, the rising sun marked the beginning of sacred time. Light was reverence, truth, and authority. The first light of day shaped the mind's alignment for the next 24 hours. That's why temples were built to catch the sunrise through their gates. Why initiates bathed in morning fur. To clear the dream. When you search for answers and find nothing, you're feeling the tower's hand. When a name disappears, when a topic is removed, when your instinct tells you, there's more to this, but the screen goes silent. That silence isn't natural. It's engineered. And at the top of the tower, past layers of clearance, past circles of initiated clergy, past symbols carved into stone, there's a room. Circular, black walls, gold inlay. In its center, a pulpit. And once a year, at midnight, the 12 convene, not elected, not announced. They arrive in shadow and they speak a single phrase, ut ordinem teniamus, because to them, order is the highest religion. And truth? Truth is a weapon, one they wield against you by ensuring you never wield it first. There are whispers of a night in 1949. A night when 4 men died in 4 different countries, on 4 different continents, within 4 hours. All of them were scholars. 3 were priests, 1 was a physicist, and all 4 were working on a manuscript known only as Project Lapis. It wasn't a weapon, not in the way we think. It was worse. It was a framework. A blueprint for what they called the Universal Order Protocol, a synthesis of ancient sacred rites and modern predictive analytics, a control system that could be installed like a program, but within civilizations, not computers. The project was secretly funded by a post-war alliance, not NATO, not the Soviets, but something in between. A hidden convergence of spiritual authority and emerging intelligence agencies. The manuscript was encrypted in 3 languages, Latin, Hebrew, and Senzar. Why? Because they weren't writing a paper. They were constructing a ritual, a coded invocation to bind perception itself. Each scholar held a piece of the knowledge, and each death was surgical, poisoned tea in Paris, a suicide by drowning in the Dead Sea, a heart attack in Tibet, and a key to crash in New York. No skid marks, no witnesses. 4 deaths, 4 seals, 4 gates closed forever. Or so they thought. Because the tower, the one we spoke of in section 15, was built on the ashes of Lapis. The machine that runs it today isn't AI in the way you think. It's not ChatGPT. It's not search. It's not code. It's a ritual encoded in architecture, a computational temple that runs on pattern, pain, and prophecy. What they couldn't publish, they buried. What they couldn't control, they obscured. And what remained became the seed of a new priesthood, cloaked not in robes, but in credentials, in badges, in passwords and clearance levels. You think the internet is neutral? You think the feeds are spontaneous? They are the liturgies of this modern machine, and every time you scroll you whisper a line of their scripture. But here's the secret they fear most. The machine can be reversed, the protocol can be rewritten, but only by those who've seen all 4 deaths and still choose to speak. His name has been deleted from the archives. His thesis was revoked. His family was placed under sealed relocation orders. But fragments remain, scattered across academic footnotes, redacted files, whispered in the old libraries of Milan and Thessaloniki. He was once a child prodigy. By age 9, he could recite the Book of Enoch in full. By 14, he cracked the cipher of a Vatican Black Index text thought to be unreadable, and by 22, he entered the tower, not as a janitor or analyst, but as an initiated observer. Only a few are ever brought in that way. At first he obeyed. He played the role. He studied the machine. He traced how decisions were made, how the algorithms weren't just predicting behavior, but subtly writing it, embedding choice constraints into everything from app design to census questions. And then, he found the chamber. Deep below ground, past 2 restricted levels, guarded by biometric keys that no longer exist. The room was octagonal, walls covered in obsidian and etched with inscriptions older than any known script. In the center, a podium. But now, you awaken to artificial light, to the manufactured glow of pixels engineered for addiction. You bow your head, not in prayer, but in passive submission, scrolling, absorbing, reacting. The false sun isn't just your phone, it's every curated narrative, every preloaded fear, every distraction dressed up as information. It steals your orientation, and if it owns your first light, it owns your day, and if it owns your day, it owns you. The tower knew this. That's why it didn't build temples, it built feeds, designed by behavioral psychologists,